Welcome to the Reframing Eye Care podcast. I am Dr. Maria Sampalis. Today's guest is Dr. Stephen Lowinger. He is an optometrist at Costco's in Miami, and I had reached out to him to be on the podcast because he's a well-known optometrist and has multiple subleases, and I thought he'd be great insight for the listeners that are tuning in every week to get more information on corporate optometry. So thanks, Doc, for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So for those of you that do not know, Dr. Lowinger, he is a board certified optometric physician in Florida, and he's practiced in Southern Florida for over 20 years, was born in Florida and raised in Miami. He's a managing optometrist for his eye care center. He's got 3 locations in Costco in the greater Miami area. He's been a speaker for Alcon, Vistakon, Bausch & Lomb, CooperVision, and Allergan over the years, and is currently on the CooperVision's Costco advisory board and has been a contributing columnist and editor for AACO magazine and a great advocate for corporate optometry. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So give us a little bit of background. So how did you come about managing multiple subleases, and how does that differ than just managing one?
Well, let's start out with the easy things. So both of my parents are opticians. My father is no longer with us. He's deceased. My mom is still alive, but she's retired. So I've been in the optical industry in one way or another since I was like 4 or 5 years old. Went to optometry school, came out, and got a lease relatively quickly. South Florida is kind of an interesting market in terms of what's available and what's not at any given time. And then it took a while because, every corporate entity has kind of a different philosophy as to how they do things. Costco traditionally hasn't been a multiple location kind of concept. It was there were a couple people who had it, but it had more to do with availability than it had to do with ability. And so I spent probably the first 15 years in practice, maybe the first 10 years in practice with one location. And then probably the next 5 or 7 years convincing Costco why I should have a second location. Finally, after a bunch of, that, and as a matter of fact, Gary Gerber, to use a name, Gary Gerber did a presentation for the Costco higher ups that I happened to be at. And he mentioned something to the effect of, well, if you have a doctor who can do it with one store, you might as well give them another. And I looked at the manager at the time. I said, you brought him in. And so that's kind of what opened the door. And, you will find there's a couple of Costco docs that I'm really good friends with that have multiple leases. It's a different set of muscles. If you're sitting there in one practice and you're, flailing at trying to get your employees all in a row, your system all doing well and all that kind of stuff, you may not have scalability. If you're the type of person who, you can create a template and then, kind of like McDonald's or Chick-fil-A or any of these places, you can, move that template to the next location and have everything continue to work. That's how you become a doctor who has multiples. Again, in some states and in some places, you just will fall into it because there's such a need that, a corporate parent will give you 4 stores or 3 stores and have you work a half day in a bunch of them. But you need to have the plan for when it gets busy enough that you need another doctor. How am I going to do that?
That's correct. So when you took on the second one, how did you manage to, start to change things, and what obstacles did you come about that you maybe didn't think of when they finally gave you the second sublease?
Well, I mean, the biggest issue when you get the second sublease is you have to, and again, you have a little bit of it already with your first lease. If you take a couple of days off and you have a doctor who comes in and covers for you, your staff learns how to deal with that doctor, and then you can translate that to another location where you take staff members, train them properly, and then the other doctor does the stuff. The biggest issue really became kind of something that I dealt with when I was starting out, where I would do coverage in a bunch of different places, is that you start getting calls when you're in the middle of seeing patients about the internet going down at your location. So you have to have kind of systems in place, both with your staff to troubleshoot, and then with people that you can call. Obviously I'm not going to stop seeing patients to go fix an internet problem. But we have IT guys and things like that. They're on call that can help us. So it's getting all those processes in place and really kind of figuring out how to keep the ball rolling without having to be the one, pushing it every so often.
Did you find working at Costco's that, having upper management team to help you with those troubleshoot issues, or kind of give you guidance? I mean, I know you were experienced and took on the second one, and then just having a network of doctors you can kind of reach out with, like mentors and things like that, that kind of helped you just be like, hey, this is what typically happens at a Costco's. Maybe it is the internet, maybe it's something else, to kind of, so you kind of know what is up ahead.
I will say that this is kind of probably my biggest blind spot. Okay, is that I don't have a mentor. I don't think I've ever had a mentor. I have certain optometrists that I've learned a lot from in terms of practice, in terms of how to see patients. But all the practice mistakes I made myself and learned from them. Now, I will say that that is probably not the best way to do things, but I'm stubborn. Now that I'm a little bit up, I'm seasoned as an optometrist, I tend to listen a little bit more to my peers. I do know that there was a certain time, and again, the AAC kind of comes into this, where I was trying to decide certain facets of what I was doing. I already had 2 locations, and this was before I got the third. And I did speak to some of the ones who had multiple Walmart leases and stuff like that to ask them, hey, how do you do this? Or what are you doing about that? Like, when do you put 2 doctors in the same store? What do the numbers look like when you want to do stuff like that? And at that point, I was ready to accept that kind of advice. I will say that very early on in my career, stupidly, I was not someone who would have, if somebody would have given me good advice, I probably still would have gone and banged my head against the wall myself for a little while. The only piece of advice that I think I ever took, before I was like 27 or 28, was my dad telling me that I probably should be an optometrist if I was losing interest in going to med school. And that was the only piece of advice that I listened to probably in my first, foray. And then everything else, I just had to bang my head against the wall and learn myself.
Yeah. Some people are going to follow that same path. Some have mentors, some don't have mentors. So some are going to learn by themselves or find ways to learn. Whether it's just watching videos or reading books and things like that. I never really had a mentor either, and kind of had to learn the hard way. And I think it came out better that way too, because if you learn from your own mistakes, right, and going through it.
Yeah, yes and no. What I would say is I have a couple of people that I'm not going to necessarily say I've been their mentor, but I've done a lot of lecturing on corporate optometry and especially here at Nova down in South Florida. And I've had a couple of people who have basically done exactly what I've done, where they've ended up with multiple locations and multiple practices. And, maybe they're just being nice to me when they say it, but they're like, until you came in and lectured our class, we had no idea that was even possible. And so, a couple of them have built very, very nice, groups of doctors in other modalities, not necessarily in Costco. Most of them, down here, Costco's are kind of spoken for, but Luxottica, VisionWorks, things like that. I have some friends who have really been successful, maybe even more successful than I've been, because they were able to see someone who did it and then came up with better ideas on their own. In my case, some of the better ideas, nobody ever gave it to me. I just kind of had to figure it out on my own.
Well, now there's more information out there, right, than ever before. So it's important, right? So like, you're going to schools, you have other doctors talking at schools and getting information out there and learning how to grow a business in this setting. That information was never really there before. So it's good to have this information out there, and it's doctor to doctor information instead of maybe corporation to doctor, and how they want things structured in your office and things like that. So when you took over, you had to hire your own, Costco has to hire your own staff. What does the process look like that?
So the original process was very simple. And I just hired, a patient who I needed to do my filing. That was back in the day. It evolved to a situation where she left, and I hired someone from actually she worked in VisionWorks. I hired her in, and she basically changed my practice, because I was still making this all up as I went along. And she actually had some training in how to be a tech and how to do things a certain way and how to run the office. And basically, her name was Natalie. Natalie kind of set the template for how I've run my office ever since. Now, the way that we find employees, it went from word of mouth to Craigslist to now, Indeed brings us most of our people. And you just have to be prepared for it to be a numbers game, because, you'll get, 65 people who will answer your post for a job. And then to get, out of those 65, to get 3 of them to show up for an interview is usually pretty good numbers. So then you have to just kind of weed through that. But I mean, we have a structure in place now where we have I'd say about 14 employees, one primary office manager, and then most of the rest of my employees are part-timers that they're either have small kids at home, so they're just kind of extra income, or they're in school on their way to something else. I've had, so far I've had 2, and I have 2 more techs of mine who have now gone to optometry school. One who's graduated, one unfortunately didn't, passed away right before her senior year, which was heartbreaking. And I got 2 in there right now. And it's nice to see them go through, because they may have had that idea in the first place, but I have heard from all of them, like, working inside your office makes being in optometry school very easy, because I already know how the process works. So, you find people, a lot of times the college people that I find are generally pre-medical something. And so working inside of a doctor's office gives them either the experience they need to move on in whatever job they want, or it allows them better bona fides to get into, optometry school, med school, whatever they're looking for.
Yeah, that's what I find too. One of the big questions that pops up in the Facebook group, Corporate Optometry, is whether doctors should hire their own staff or allow, the corporate entity to hire their staff. What is your opinion on that? And what do you think doctors should do when they have a choice? I mean, certain offices don't have a choice, but what do you think is the best option for these doctors?
That is a great question. I've had this discussion almost to a point of argument with some people over the years, that it's always important to have at least someone in your office who cares about your office and not the corporate office. And what I mean by that is, if I want to dot all the I's tomorrow with little hearts, I tell my staff we're dotting all the I's tomorrow with little hearts, and it gets done. When I'm working with a corporate partner, again, and I'll use the optical as an example. The optical is Costco's, my staff is mine. I can't go over to the optical staff and go, you need to do this. It's like, hey, can we do this for the patient? Blah, 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 this and that. That's a different thing. Whereas if I have something going on with my staff, I'm always polite as I can be, but if the crap hits the fan, at that point I can go, this, and this need to be done, get it done, and it does. So I've always said that regardless of, and going back to the multiple conversation, because that actually ties back in, if you're going to have a practice that has a certain philosophy behind it, how do you keep that philosophy working when you're not in the office? And if you don't have staff doing that for you, then it's a different practice when you're not there to when you are there. And so that's why I believe in staff. So even my friends who have had, to use Walmart, for example, Walmart, they generally give you your staff as well, but you can have your own staff side by side. And most of the successful optometrists that I've seen inside Walmart, they go beyond just using the Walmart staff, and they at least have a liaison for themselves to help with that kind of stuff. In other places, if you look at, like, for instance, to use VisionWorks, for example, where they hire their own staff, the doctors who are successful is they find people that they've worked with in the past who have, they've seen are competent, and then they'll try to, say to Luxottica, hey, you should probably hire this person. They'll be great with me. And so the doctor gets all the loyalty of finding someone, but with somebody else paying for it. So that's kind of nice too. But the one thing that I always hear in certain practices is you get that person who came in that yesterday they were, cleaning bathrooms. Yesterday they were, selling, doing rental cars, and they got a job from this corporate entity to be a tech. And, that can set your office back, 15, 20 patients that week if it's a new person, as opposed to the people that you've cultivated over time.
No, that's correct. So what I have found is, if you're starting off small, maybe, if you're trying it out, you're a small sublease, maybe have the staff there. You have more time to do most stuff. In a busy practice, big practice, then having your own staff is good. And again, you can delegate, and during downtime, checking billing, things like that, if you want to do billing in-house, right, and things like that. How do you do your billing? Is it in-house? Do you send it out?
So I'm going to, one last point about the last thing, and then we'll go to this one. The other thing is, going back to staff, is, even here in South Florida, where the minimum wage hasn't really become anything special, I pay my staff starting at $15 an hour and up. If you say to yourself, if you're paying a person $15 an hour and they can get you one more patient per hour because they make your life easier, you're making money on that person. It's just simple math there. So I'm sorry. The question you had again was.
So the question was about medical billing. So
Okay.
when it's downtime, I have my staff multitask, right? So they can check billing claims and do things in house if we can. So someone that might be concerned about hiring someone, let's say, there's a lot of things they can do. Like you said, just one more patient, making your life easy. Maybe they're calling in an RX for you that you don't have to do, or doing tasks or teaches and things like that you don't have to necessarily do because they're trained and they help you with that time. So I have found that too, is time is important, right? And if these people are happy and want to be there, if you can squeeze in, like you said, one more patient, an hour, and maybe you're there longer days and less days per se on certain subleases, if they can do it, that helps.
Right. I mean, efficiencies matter, and there are a lot of different ways to make things happen and make things work, but the efficiencies all matter. And again, so going to insurance, I really didn't Costco wasn't a big insurance group when I first started there. They take a lot of them now, and it was basically kind of two things happened at the same time. Number one, once I got on an EHR, that was the first thing, because I loathe paperwork. I mean, I loathe it. So the whole idea of filling out Form A and this thing and blah, 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 and all those other forms to get paid, I wanted no part of it. So the nice thing is most EHRs make it very easy for you to bill in code, use you with some third-party company that helps you with that. And then originally what we contracted with was Eric Botz's optometric billing consultants, and OBC helped me both get on different plans, and then they did my kind of super bill stuff. So, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. You could have a person in-house that, if they understand medical billing, and generally you'll catch them from coming from someplace else, or if you know enough about medical billing, you can train someone, and God bless you if you can, because that's where you lose me. But if not, there are a bunch of third-party companies that are willing to help you with that, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's no different in my mind than having a credit card taking a credit card. You're going to take a certain percentage goes to the credit card company, but it's one less hassle of you collecting all this cash or hoping the checks don't bounce or whatever. Go back in the old days. So yeah, Eric, OBC and Eric really helped me with all that kind of stuff initially. Now, our EHR has evolved again. Unfortunately, OBC doesn't work with our EHR, so we had to find a different group. But the good news is, going back to that, we have a couple staff members that we've trained on. When we get all this information back of what's been paid, what hasn't been paid, they know what to do to go figure out where didn't we dot the I incorrectly, so that we didn't get paid. So, medical billing, the nice thing is a lot of medical, especially vision billing, with a lot of parties have just become website based, where you could just go in there, check all the things that you need to and all that. So it's really not hard, because most of the people that we're hiring, they're coming off an internet ad already. So they know how to surf the web. They know how to use things on a computer. They may not know how to run an OCT, but they certainly know how to use computer stuff. So you can train them one way, or you can have a third-party company do it for you the other.
One of the other big questions that comes up in the Facebook group is about when does the doctor take on EHR? I know this is a big question right now for Walmart doctors transitioning. And when did you know that you needed to have EHR in your offices, and how do you choose which EHR you've gone to?
Well, so there's two really good questions. My first foray when I realized EHR is because when I realized that, unlike most private practices, we have very limited space, and if paper charts start to eat up that space, it becomes very, very hard for you to see a patient. You can't put an OCT in the office if you've got 6 file cabinets with your patient charts. So in my case, I went kind of from file cabinets, which were easy to buy at Costco because they sold them back then, to I had like a carpenter make me something that could hold more files in less space. And then the problem with that thing was it was so top heavy that one day it just simply broke. And when that happened, that's when I said, all right, enough of this. This was 2006. Our first EHR was in 2006. And it was, again, I don't necessarily want to tell companies, but at the time it was the state of the art for what existed. It was a server-based system where you had your own server in your office, and that started the ball rolling. We didn't really need a very strong internet signal, which we didn't have back then. I mean, we were on dial-up, or not barely past dial-up, like DSL speeds. So we would, still didn't do a lot of insurance, but we did some. When we get to the point where we got 2 offices, now I'm like, well, I want to have EHR from day one in the new office because I'm not going back to paper. And in that case, when we started examining, it'd been about 7 years later. And so the technology had increased. You didn't need to have a server in your office. You could have a server online. And so just through pricing, I ended up with another company. Well, now I just changed about a year ago, and it's the same concept. 10 years later, technology's changed again. So as opposed to logging onto a remote server, which can be clunky at times and sometimes can just fail you altogether, now there are companies that are doing web page based EHR. So it's as fast as opening up any tab, as fast as what we're doing right here today. And so because of that, it just makes things easier and more efficient along the way. So to now go back to answer your question, when should you put in EHR if you're not someone like me who started in the Stone Ages with a beeper and whatever? It's as soon as you start your practice. I mean, I will tell you that regardless of which EHR it is, and you can price through and decide. I have my opinions now, but whatever EHR you decide to start with, you're probably going to end up with for a while. So what you want to be sure of is, maybe inexpensive when you first get it. There's, they want you to buy an EHR. Just make sure how scalable it is, number one. And number two, what happens when I really need to expand it? Because that's the issue I ran into between my first one and my second one, is to get the EHR up and running in the second location was going to cost me as much as to get a web-based EHR running in 2. And now the same thing. It's the one that I was using was based on how many terminals you used. And I wanted some that I just want web page. If I have 35 people who log on, I want 35 people to be able to log on because the speed on this thing should be fine. And that's what I found now. So it's all dependent. I would say if I was starting a practice cold today, of all the things you're going to spend money on, the EHR is probably the one you'll get the most value with from day one.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, one of the other things that comes up is being able to partner with corporate. You've been super successful over the years, 20 years working with Costco's, and obviously, they find you as a doctor of value since they've given you multiple subleases. What are some advice you can give doctors on, how to approach working with managers and helping reach corporate goals, and then having them understand your goals for your practice?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing is understanding the corporation that you're working with. So, Costco back in the day, and I think they still have it somewhere, has a credo, and they go by a credo that it's all about, value to the member, value to our employees, and then value to our stockholders. So they bring them. So Costco, and this is not a surprise to anybody, they put their member first. That's their goal. So in anything, and again, it dovetails well with what I do because I believe in excellent patient care. I want to give that patient an experience that they don't get in other places. I don't like to waste their time. I don't like to make them wait. So to me, patient care and member service are very similar concepts. And so whenever I'm having a conversation with Costco, I know that as long as I'm doing it in 2 ways. Number one, I'm doing it in a professional manner because I know a lot of doctors will say, well, they're doing this to me and it's not fair. This isn't your parents. This is a corporate entity that you're working with. They only want to hear it's not personal. It's just business. Okay. But the second thing is understanding that if I'm doing something, even if Costco disagrees with it, if I'm doing it in service of the member, that is in service of their credo. And so I've had conversations with Costco in the past where they've had issues with certain contact lens manufacturers, certain other things, where I've said, hey, that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, my job is to take care of my patient, which is to take care of your member. If I have to fit them with a lens that, frankly, you guys don't sell, but it's in their best interest, or if I don't have to give them glasses at all other than reading glasses, but I write a prescription for them to use Restasis because they have dry eye, the fact that it's not getting filled in the optical and getting filled in the pharmacy, you're still doing well by me, And that's the thing is Costco understands that. Now, there are some places that you'll go into that you believe in me, that the patient care is the most important part, but you'll go into a corporation setting where to them it's all a numbers game, that we don't care about we don't care if people have to wait 2 hours to be seen. We just want to make sure they get seen. and the quality of how they. So I worked with a company. I mean, I guess I can mention. I worked with Sears very early on in my career. They no longer exist, so I can say that. What I found with Sears is the way I want to take care of my patient and the way they wanted to take care of their customer were not exactly the same thing. And so I had a lot of patients who loved me and hated the optical side when they went over there. So that's the part you have to really kind of work on, is understanding your strengths and making sure that they dovetail with the corporate parent that you're working with, the corporate partner. And number two, just understanding that when you want to have a conversation with, a building manager about, hey, I'd like to be larger, I'd like my office to have more space on the next remodel or things like that, you have to put it in terms that they understand. Listen, it's going to give me the ability to take better care of the patients. It's going to give me the ability to see more patients. It's going to make the optical busier, and it's going to allow me to service more members. That was the argument, and it's a good argument. It's not, it's not something like, well, I think I deserve a bigger office. That's not going to get you anywhere with anybody.
No, that's good. That's good advice for young doctors listening to this podcast that are taking on a sublease. Another thing when I talk to young doctors, they kind of try to compare corporate to private practice. You tell me about your experience and how this partnership might have been better for you in this situation than a private practice.
Well, I mean, I'm not here to denigrate a private practice. What I will say is that, especially down here in South Florida, back in that time, and even now, in South Florida back at that time, it was kind of a game of musical chairs. There were only so many spots available. Opening a practice cold in South Florida, well, not South Florida, but Miami or Dade, Broward County is still not very easy. I only know of a couple of doctors who have done that over the past couple of years. So when I came out, there was a lot of doctors that I was talking to about practices, and sorry, I just lost my headphone. And all of them pretty much had their practices valued a lot more than what they were actually worth. Okay.
And that's still goes on.
Right. Of course it does. Of course it does. And that's the part that's really problematic, especially when you get into the politics of private versus corporate optometry, is, these private practitioners will lament us being in corporate, but they don't realize that they've priced us out of being able to afford something like that. But okay, not to denigrate. I think private practice is a different concept. Again, I have, parents who are opticians. I've done everything from put blanks into envelopes to be sold wholesale to, watching, grinding lenses, all that stuff. I've done all of that or been a part of it. My dad built multiple labs throughout the years. He was a craftsman as an optician for sure. When it came around to me, I wanted, there was a lot of opportunity there, but I found in working here that this became really easy. I don't have any headaches. That's the beauty of corporate practice. It's not so much that, or the better way that I can describe it is all of us, regardless of our profession, we take on a certain amount of risk. Okay. Some of us are very risk averse. Some of us are completely and utterly don't care. We're going to roll the dice. And so, if you're a risk averse person, a corporate lease or even being an employed optometrist is not a bad answer, because you don't have to worry about anything. And again, my wife, who I would call a risk averse type of person, when I first came out, she's like, hey, why are you even looking at getting, a lease or this? Not, you should just work for an ophthalmologist. You'll get a good steady salary and this. I'm like, I know I'm worth a lot more than what they're going to pay me, and I'm going to prove that. And of course, after what I've done, she's like, don't ever take business advice from me again. And I'm like, all right, cool. But the bottom line is, like, I had a certain amount. I didn't necessarily want to deal with inventory. I didn't necessarily want to deal with breakage and all that stuff. I watched my dad deal with all that. I watched my dad, make a pair of glasses for someone that was an absolute work of art, and have that person put it on, go like this, and say, I hate this pair of glasses. Okay. So the bottom line is, there's plenty of money to be made in materials. I'm not going to say that there isn't. It just has to do with, I don't necessarily need to make that, and again, finding the right corporate parent, because again, that was another negotiation very early on. I actually was contacted by Walmart. This is before I got to Costco. But back then I didn't like their lease terms. I didn't feel like those lease terms were what were advantageous to me. And it happens to be one of the busiest Walmarts down here in South Florida. after the fact, but I got it offered on the ground floor back in the day. But Walmart's, at that time, their lease packages just made no sense, whereas Costco's made a lot more sense to me. And again, I'm not what I would call risk averse. I believe I'm betting on myself, but I also know what I'm good at, which is, seeing patients in logistics. So being in a corporate practice allows me to do that. Now, when I was at the FOA meeting, I sat in on a very nice presentation by Vision Source. And again, I don't take anything away from that. They have done a very nice job of doing what they're going to do for people. It is kind of pseudo corporate private, but again, that's not to split hairs. But the bottom line is, if you're a person who, I don't want to take out another $200,000 in loans after taking $200,000 in loans to get here, to start a practice and do all this kind of stuff, or buy a practice from someone. I've always found that anybody, there are very few practices that I've ever seen that are worth what the doctor's asking for. There was probably one that I remember succinctly, and the funny thing is that doctor's kids are both my patients now, but because he's retired. But I remember when his practice went up for sale, when I heard it went up for sale, that was a practice I tried to jump on. And unfortunately, he was closing like 2 days later, so I couldn't convince him. But most everybody else, it's very hard to take on that much more debt coming out of school. It's hard to
you're right. And unfortunately, I think it's gotten worse over the years too, because now with private equity, they're getting a bigger number than what that is. So that's been what I've heard from doctors too, and that a lot of these doctors wait for the end for the big payout for retirement, because of them investing in their business over the years. And so for you, let's talk about some challenges. What have been some challenges in a corporate lease? What can doctors look out for, anticipate, versus, having a private practice or maybe being employed?
Well, here's what I would say is the best one. I have at times a fairly short temper. Okay. And if I was a private practitioner, I'm not sure that short temper wouldn't show itself more than it is because I have a corporate parent that I work with. So sometimes I have certain thoughts in my head that I would really like to say to the patient, and I don't, because I do have someone who could conceivably pull my lease depending on how far I go. Whereas if it was my own room, my own door, some people might have gotten their eyebrows singed off. So it makes me behave a little bit better. I think that's the first thing. But to the point, it's understanding when you get into a corporate situation, you have to understand who you're working with and who you're getting into. Not all corporations are made equal. And I wish they were to a certain extent. I wish a lot of them were like Costco, and even some of the others. I'm not going to denigrate. There's some ideas that other corporate entities have that I wish Costco would adopt. And there are a lot of things that Costco does that I wish other corporations would adopt. But the bottom line is understanding who you're working with. They may have a different philosophy than you do. They may have a different, in Costco and Walmart, and these big box style retailers really exist just to get more people in the door, which is fine. Whether they buy stuff in the optical, whether they buy stuff in nutraceuticals, whether they buy stuff, in the pharmacy, Costco and Walmart, they don't care. They just want to make sure people are coming in the door. When you start dealing with some of the other corporate entities that are freestanding, there are situations where, there are challenges. If you want to practice, full on medical optometry, you may not be able to do it in some corporations. You can do it in many of them. You can do it inside of a Costco. You can do it inside of a Walmart. But, some of the other ones, they're like, well, that patient didn't stay and buy any glasses. So you have to, and again, that's fine. The most important thing with any of these corporate entities is when you say, listen, I'm building a practice. This patient may not, have bought glasses here today, but they're going to bring the rest of their family because I just treated their eye disease. And so some corporations will understand that and understand the value behind it, and some won't. So before you step into anything, that's what you need to kind of get an idea of is, does this people have the same vision that I do? The second part is, well, and again, this goes state by state. Here in Florida, the rules are a little bit easier in that we can't be compelled to work a certain amount of days and stuff like that. Obviously, Texas's law is better than ours. And then some other people's laws are worse than ours. the bottom line is that, you have to decide if what they're offering you is worth it. If I was in a state where, we happen to have 7-day coverage at 2 of the stores of the 3, and the bottom line is because the stores can't support that. I can have a doc. I generally don't work it. I can have a doctor work, make good money for himself, make good money for the staff, and I can make a couple bucks in my pocket while I'm watching football. That doesn't hurt. But it took a bunch of years till we got to the point where I thought Sundays would be viable. And so if you have a store, there's a lot of places that I've spoken to over the years or have conversations with doctors who are looking at a practice to go into a corporate lease. And they're like, well, they have this set up from day one. I'm like, just looking at the numbers, this is a 3-day-a-week practice right now. If they want
so tell us, yes. So that comes up huge. Tell us how many patients that you think they should see per day in order to add more.
8.
Day. 8. At least 8. Okay. So 8
at
to 10.
Right. So
okay,
the way that the math, well, again, it depends on how many contact lens exams you're doing as well. So back in the day when I first started with my lease, I was an employed optometrist doing fill-in work here and there. And I found out that when I got to 8 patients a day, I was making more money than I would get paid working for somebody else. Okay. So anytime the office got to 8 patients, I knew that I could support another day of me working there. And that number has, well, now to be fair, what I charge for an eye exam has gone up since back then. So, now it's, less. But what I would say is once you get to the point where, the companies will use book out. I don't love that. It's really a situation is, can you handle what's walking in the door without feeling stressed at the end of it? So, again, going back to, do you have a staff member or not? If you don't have a staff member and you're seeing 9 or 10 patients a day, that's usually a heavy day because you don't have people to delegate to and all that kind of stuff. In some places you might be able to see, I have a friend of mine who could see 25, 30 patients in a day. She doesn't pay for any staff members, but she has a good staff support at her Walmart. But she does say, I'm beat, I'm done. And so, if you, the way that I look at it is you need 8 to 10 patients a day to justify the day. So if an optical is seeing, so let's say you look at an optical and the numbers that they're doing is they're doing 35 patients a week. Well, that's probably about 3.5 to 4 days. If you go in there and they want 6 days, that you're going to starve a couple of those days because the patient base is not there. And the nice thing, like I said, with Costco was I didn't have to do any of that stuff. So as we get busier, I will be here more. And I've gotten to the point now where we're so busy that we have 2 doctors on the same day and stuff like that. It's just understanding that piece of the puzzle.
No, that's important. And doctors should never lose money in corporate optometry. So if you're losing money, then you need to figure out your hours of operation, your rent, what doctors coverage.
When I say losing money, I mean it 2 ways. I think that you can go in tomorrow and work in a practice and you'll see 2 patients and you'll probably make $150 seeing 2 patients. So you didn't lose money. It's just you lost money because if you're working anywhere else that day, you could have made 3, 4, 5 times that. So it's not like a private practice where you've thrown all this money into it and then if nobody shows up, not only are you at 0, you're at negative numbers. In a corporate practice, you're in a corporate practice, your negative number is what you could get paid working outside of there that day.
Well, and then also if they want that 7 or 6 day coverage and you're not doing it, but you hire a doctor. I've had that where they hire a doctor. That's what I'm saying. They hire a doctor. Right, you don't really lose your money. So there's always something you can do, or you can get fill in and things like that. Now,
but again, and we have that challenge too. I mean, we just, one of our doctors, shout out to Ray if you're listening to this today. One of my doctors who worked with me for years, he relocated to Texas. Now he's in a different lease in Texas, and it was a bit of a shock. And now, where we had a doctor who he always made, he could see everybody. Now we have some doctors that there are days where I lose money on that particular doctor being there. The good news for me is it building towards something? I also had, this is kind of a personal note. There was a doctor in one of the Costco locations. But again, Costco sometimes will call me and say, hey, Steve, this doctor, we're not really sure. They seem to have a question. Can you give them a call? And we had one doctor where it was in a state where Costco kind of wanted the doctor to be open a little bit more. And the doctor was really against it. And I was talking to the doctor and I'm like, listen, if you open this day, are you going to lose money paying for the doctor there? And the doctor said, no, I'll just break even. I'm like, well, listen, Costco's annoyed enough about this at this point that they're calling me to have a phone call with you to see how I can help you. If it's not costing you any money and it's kind of what they're looking for in whatever, you may want to pay it lip service. And she didn't, and later on ended up losing the lease. Again, these things happen. What I'm saying is there may be days where you break even on a doctor and you're like, well, wait a minute, this isn't fair. I want to make money every day. Again, it's a business. You're in most of these locations, maybe not the big box retailers, but in most of these optical only style retailers, you're the engine that runs things for them. If you're not there, they kind of grind to a halt. So you have to kind of mitigate both concepts. If it's one thing if it's like, well, I'm wasting my time being there because we don't see enough patients. It's a different thing. Well, I break even by having a friend of mine cover that day. That's totally fine. Sometimes that's kind of the price you pay to stay in goodwill with people.
Yeah. Now, what's one thing that you wish you've done differently over the last 20 years in practice, and has your perception changed over the years?
Well, my perception has definitely changed over the years. I already kind of alluded, there's kind of like three that I would think. I alluded to the first one is I didn't really have any mentors, and I probably should have listened more, because there are some people who really tried to give me advice that I was at that time too hard-headed to know. So, listen to people. Some people, one thing I will say to any young optometrist out there is there is no optometrist that I've ever met who is worried about you taking their job. You could open a practice right next door to me. As a matter of fact, there is a doctor who has a Target right next door to me. And I basically went to her because she just took over the location. I'm like, listen, if there's anything I can do to help you out, let me know. Because optometrists, there's so many patients to see.
Yeah.
There's so many patients to see that ophthalmology is trying to take them from us, especially down here in Florida. But there's so many patients to see that we don't care if somebody else opens up near us. Hopefully they will practice at their best abilities and stuff like that. But, you deal with that. So really that's the first one, is listening to other people, understanding the grace of other people who have done this before you and the troubles they have. Now, some of them may not apply, especially back when I started, because there wasn't a lot of doctors in corporate when I started. But the second thing I would probably say is I wish I would have been a little less risk averse on a couple of things. I probably should have had the EHR a little bit earlier. I probably should have brought staff in a little bit earlier. I feel like I wasn't the latest of adopter. I was probably an early adopter, but I wish I was even an even earlier early adopter. I think that, understanding the technology, like right now in 2 of our locations, we do screening OCTs on every patient. And the reason I do it, and it's just part of the exam fee, is because I like knowing what's happening around the macula. It makes my life easier. If I'm refracting a patient and things aren't coming out the way that I want to, I can flip over to the OCT. If the macula looks good, I'm like, well, either you got to work harder, Steve, or they've got something in the way between there and there because their retina's fine. And I do feel personally, this is my personal opinion, that at some point in the next 15, 20 years, as OCT prices keep coming down, then it's going to be standard of care for a screening OCT. I just think it's a great piece of equipment. It tells you a lot. So that's the other thing. I wish I was a little bit more adaptive and adoptive of these things early on. The last thing is I wish I would have created a better medical optometry foundation for my practice when it was still small, because that does drive a lot of business. But sometimes you'll get so busy that you can't go backwards in time and redo that. So, I mean, we tried to do, I have a lot of the dry eye stuff in my office. I haven't gone as far as like an IPL or tear care or one of those things. But we had to backtrack from dry eye because the office got so busy that we can't put the process in place because it's going to waste too much staff time with how the office is configured. Whereas if, let's say, when we were on the ground floor before the office got as busy as it did, we had a good system in place, it would be easier. So a lot of times it's just looking at what you're good at and what you want to do and doing that medical stuff, because at the end of the day, most people come to you for glasses and contacts, but at the end of the day, having that medical setup means that you become full service and people trust you with the whole thing. So those are probably the 2 or 3 most important things that I would say.
I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Some great insight, some valuable nuggets for our listeners to take home back to their practices. And if anyone wants to contact you, do you have an email where they can?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I went to the University of Florida, so I am Gator iDoc, GATOREYEDOC @gmail.com.
Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insights.
All right. Have